Hi Founders fans, Jason here, and today we're going to be talking about Timothy Pickering. I've tried to shoot this video 5 or 6 times with a nice introduction, and I keep bumbling over my words today, so forgive me, and Timothy Pickering especially, please forgive me if I'm bumble over my words for some reason. But let's talk about Timothy Pickering because he had a long career as a revolutionary and a founder of the United States. First of all, Timothy Pickering was from Salem, Massachusetts. Yes, that Salem, Massachusetts, though it was about 100 years after the witch trials, so don't worry about that. However, Pickering was a Harvard graduate, a well-educated young man who, by the time he was 30 and things started getting hostile, he was a leader of a local militia. He became a lieutenant in his local militia. And this militia just happened to be part of something called Leslie's Retreat, which was a brief, almost engagement in February of 1775, about 2 months before Lexington and Concord. And basically, the British were out looking for supplies from farmers, as would happen all over the place, but notably at Lexington and then Concord. But they came and there was a standoff at a bridge, and this is a very brief version of the story, but they convinced the British to go back home. And that's very interesting because had they not convinced the British to peaceably leave, there might have been shots fired, and Timothy Pickering might have overseen the first shot heard round the world. Although, if we're being fair, there are several events in the months and weeks leading up to Lexington and Concord which could also have been that, but it's fun to speculate. Anyway, about this time, Timothy Pickering had written a book called, and I forget how the exact title is, An Easy Plan for Militia. You'd think you'd remember something that simple. And this Easy Plan for Militia, in the ensuing years, would actually become the handbook for training the Continental Army. He did not know that when he wrote it, but that happened. Of course, to be fair, the Continental Army was not trained very well until Baron von Steuben showed up and took over at Valley Forge. But anyway, as for Pickering, he would lead his unit to Lexington and Concord, and then after that he would travel with them south to New York, and that's when he came to the attention of General George Washington, who recognized his talents and recognized that he had written this particular book, and for several other reasons, Washington, who had a keen eye for spotting talent and delegating to them the right responsibilities, chose Pickering as Adjutant General. I am horrible at pronouncing that word, Adjutant General, which basically was a type of administrator for the Continental Army. And he worked closely with the quartermaster and positions like that, and the commissaries to make sure the troops were supplied and this and that, and make sure, the numbers were getting run, and, it's almost like a CFO at a modern corporation, I think. I don't own a corporation, but I think that's what you would call it. So, actually, during this time, Timothy Pickering oversees the building of the Great Chain, which was a massive chain that they welded together and put across the Hudson River to prevent the British from going either up or down, really up, but and it did its job successfully for most of the war. After that, Pickering gets another promotion a few years in, and he is moved up to Quartermaster General, where he takes over for Nathaniel Greene. Now, Nathaniel Greene was an amazing Quartermaster General, but he would end up being a much more amazing leader of armies and more or less help win the war fighting in the South. But this isn't about Greene, we're talking about Pickering. So at the end of the war, I've spoken about before, and I'll put a link to my video on Washington's Spectacles, which is a famous speech he gave at Newburgh. Pickering was one of the men at Newburgh, one of the officers who were complaining, and Washington came in and convinced everyone they were wrong and left. But Timothy Pickering was the one in the room who said, hey, all he had to do was say, I've grown old and put on some spectacles and we all change our mind. So I bring that up because Pickering clearly was a man of his, who stuck to his guns. When George Washington could bring a rest of a room of men to tears, Pickering would stand up for himself, whether in the right or the wrong. Washington must have thought he was right, because years would go by, and Pickering did move to Pennsylvania for a while, but they went back to, he would end up being recruited by George Washington as when Samuel Osgood left as the first Postmaster General. Timothy Pickering was chosen to be the second Postmaster General of the United States, which nowadays doesn't sound so important, but at the time when like all communications that traveled further than you could yell were by post, this was an amazingly important position that Pickering held for 4 years, and he only left it to take the position of Secretary at War. The second Secretary of War he took over from Henry Knox, and he held that for a year until around the end of Washington's term, where Pickering came in and he took over, I'm talking really fast, as the third Secretary of State of the United States of America. And he took over from Edmund Randolph, who had took over from Thomas Jefferson. And yeah, this is a very big, important position. In future years, the Secretary of State would be the likely candidate to run for the next presidency, not like Vice President is today. Although there was not a hard and fast rule for that, of course. Now, Pickering, as Secretary of State, would move into the Adams administration, where he and his close friend, James McHenry, and this is unfortunately what Pickering is most famous for, is he and McHenry stayed in after Washington appointed them late in his term, and John Adams became president and kept on Washington's guys to try and keep unity, and Adams really did his best. It didn't always work out. And Pickering and McHenry were more or less working for Hamilton. They were basically doing whatever Hamilton said. At this point, Pickering was also part of what's known as the Essex Junto, which was mostly a bunch of men from Massachusetts, but, you know, there were a few other stragglers who came in who were hardcore Federalists and were kind of a behind-the-scenes, almost like a think tank would be today. Either way, eventually Adams got real sick of the two guys, Pickering and McHenry. Henry, and fired them both. James McHenry, yes, sorry, and fired them both. And Pickering would leave, and he would be appointed as a United States Senator from Massachusetts. As a hardline Federalist, he was appointed as a senator in the beginning of the Thomas Jefferson Democratic-Republican administration, where he would spend 8 years being a pain in the side, pardon my French, for Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans, and at every turn try and hold them back. I'm not trying to sound rude to him. I'm not taking sides. That is just what he did. And then after that, Pickering actually became, after being a senator, became a member of the House of Representatives, which had a little more esteem than it might today. You know, we use today, many of us even maybe subconsciously look at the House of Representatives as less than the Senate. But at the time, especially with so little states, when there were almost as many senators as representatives, it was a much more respectable position. For example, even years later, John Quincy Adams would go to the House after being president. That's neither here nor there. Well, what happened was, we start getting into, hostilities with Great Britain again as the War of 1812 approaches, and there are war hawks saying, yeah, let's fight with Great Britain again. And there are other people, mostly former Federalists. The Federalist Party was dying at this point, but Pickering is one of those holdouts, and they were like, no, we're not going to go to war with Great Britain, dummy. And so Pickering decides he becomes a part of the Hartford Convention. And the Hartford Convention was a group of New Englanders who met to talk about how do we get control of this government back. Now, they didn't actually say they wanted to secede from the United States. That was not a topic on hand. One or two of the members mentioned it ahead of time, and that word kind of spread, but it was never seriously talked about. In fact, most of the people who were chosen to attend were chosen because they specifically would not do that. Famously, Nathan Dane, who I've talked about before. I'll try and remember to put that link in the comments below. But Pickering did attend the Hartford Convention, and that kind of ended, like, everyone who went to that convention, their political careers were kind of over, because they left this convention with a letter to Washington saying, yeah, we're going to go down to Washington, not Washington, President, Washington the city, we're going to go to James Madison and give him this letter and say, no, no, no. And they get there and it says, hey, we just declared war. Are you with us or are you against us? And they had this note in their hand, they're kind of like stuffing it in their pockets, like, whoopsie daisy. And from there, Timothy Pickering now, in his 60s, approaching 70 at this point, resigned to his farm and quietly finished his life. So, in summation, this is a little bit longer video than usual, but Timothy Pickering is a little bit more important of a founder. I actually forgot to mention that in between the war and his being postmaster, Pickering served as Washington's agent to the Native American, the Iroquois Nation in upstate New York, and had the Treaty of Canandaigua, also known as the Pickering Treaty, which committed peace between the Iroquois nations. There were several tribes in the area, many of whom fought against us during the Revolution, and Pickering helped bring peace to the area, which I appreciate because I currently live in the area that Timothy Pickering made peace and made it able for people to settle and live together, although how the reservations quickly shrank is a different tale, of course. So I need to bring that up because it makes Pickering particularly close to my heart. But again, this is a little bit longer video. I really appreciate you watching. I'm sure Timothy Pickering would appreciate us talking about him too. As for that, if you like this video, please hit like. It really helps me out, gets the word out there. If you are new to the channel, you just happen to stumble onto this video, please hit subscribe. I put videos out like this 5 days a week, and I hope you enjoy them, because if you made it 12 minutes into this video, you probably enjoy some of the other ones. I'm Jason. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you tomorrow.